if we were chopping and changing who led on the ball and who led off the ball week to week, I think that would become quite confusing. But it doesn't mean that players won't speak to me about what they're doing on the ball, and players won't speak to him about what they're doing off the ball. I think that's also okay, but one's leading in an area and inevitably the other's assisting in an area. So we actually probably flip those roles all the time, is that he leads on the ball and I assist on the ball, and I lead off the ball and he assists off the ball.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. I was joined today by Chris Duncan, who is the head coach of Scotland Women's senior hockey team and also the programme lead for the women's pathway within Scottish hockey. Really great conversation actually around not just the international coaching process, because actually within that, and Chris gets on to talking about some of the universal elements across club coaching and international, but we do get into some of the unique realities of when you're working with the best of the best, if you want to call it that. And we touch upon this just because of Chris's quite varied background, with the being in both planets of working with the senior team, but also within the pathway. How do you actually coach international youth players? And the conversation really moves into a space where it's about dynamics as well within the game and how you coach within the game, and but also within the coaching team and how you manage and coordinate activity within a coaching team so that you can best serve the role that you have, and that to support the players, and we get into a lot of different tangents within that around power dynamics, around authenticity, around role clarity as well, and Chris is very open and honest about a lot of his best lessons coming out of mistakes, and we talk a lot about that as well. So it's a really interesting and very important and helpful conversation, I think, for those, yes, particularly those that are in international coaching, but also just those that are within club level coaching, regardless of sport, who are wanting to know a little bit about where they need to go and routes in which they can develop, but particularly when they then become a head coach, how do you delegate, how do you coordinate, how do you consider the difference and role of a coach and a leader. And we've talked about some of the subtle distinctions there too. So really enjoyed this conversation. Again, born out of practice, born out of experience. The hockey teams just came back from Chile, really successful campaign. Chris talks a little bit about that as well, but there's a lot to be gleaned from this talk, so I hope that you enjoy it. Without any further ado, let's get into the conversation. Chris, great to have you here. How are you, just to start?
Yeah, very well, thanks, Mark. How are you doing?
Excellent. Excellent. It's a nice end to the week, start to the day. So it's a nice way of kind of bringing in the weekend a little bit. You've been a busy man, obviously. I've been quite looking forward to this chat. I know you've been so busy with the women's national team, and you've just returned from Chile as well on the back of a really positive result. How are you feeling at the moment with that, and kind of where you're at so far?
Yes, certainly not enjoying the weather back here compared to what it was across there. It's funny, we left here and it was 1 degree and we arrived in 35 degrees, and that was a bit of a shock to the system. I actually think the shock coming back to 4 degrees was worse. Doing really well. Great opportunities to travel the world with international sport, and to do it and have memories that are kind of really positive ones around performances are great. So we went out there ranked 7th, finished 5th, which is a really good outcome for us. Beat 2 teams ranked above us, which is really pleasing, and then pushed our world ranking a place higher, which puts us in the kind of highest place since records began in 2003. So yeah, all in all, a pretty positive trip, and just kind of coming back to earth and now planning for what comes next.
I know, and obviously, I think I don't envy your position in many ways. I know you're a busy man. You're obviously managing the national team at the senior level of it, and but also you act as the pathway lead for women's hockey as well within Scotland. And this was actually a conversation, and we're going to chat a little bit today about how you actually, what the coaching process is like in international management, and we will kind of flux probably between the senior game and the youth game as such. It was actually a conversation for those that listen. You started at Stirling's coaching symposium, like a really great event that was put on by Steve McDonald and the guys there at University of Stirling, and I was just really captivated by it because you were telling us a little bit about that process and also about team dynamics within that. So we'll kind of see where we get to with that, Chris. So I think maybe a good starting point with this is what actually separates international coaching from club level coaching in a way if we want to begin there?
I mean, I think it's important to make the distinction first that coaching is coaching. Like at the end of the day, we are working with people in the medium that I operate. Those people are hockey players, but I actually think that one of the simplest ways to look at it is like all coaching is the same. You're just trying to help the individuals or the teams in front of you be able to achieve their best. Consider not what they are as kind of an individual or a team on that day, but what they could be long term, and try and challenge that and nurture that process. I think one of the biggest differences is in the international sport, you are judged on results. It's probably one of the biggest changes between the kind of club and international game is that how do we develop players and understand that it's part of a journey and part of a process of development, whilst at the same time being able to generate the quick wins and the small wins that keep those that invest in us happy, and that is the reality that people want results from it. So yeah, I think it's a tricky correlation, and it's trying to kind of develop winners and develop people that know how to win, whilst not, I suppose, talking about it explicitly is probably one of the biggest differences. And we work with such a range of different people, and I think that obviously we've gone to Santiago, we've traveled the world, we've played in kind of high level competition, and as part of that there's quite like a big onus on tactical approaches and scouting, which is probably not as significant at the domestic level and club level, and that's okay. But I think it's one of the challenges that we find within hockey specifically is how do you develop a 14, 15, 16-year-old adequately in a way that they understand and they build this kind of tactical acumen whilst at the same time being able to have enough freedom. I think coaching is a tricky concept.
And is that quite tough? And I think it's really interesting straight away you mentioned that word like development, and that maybe we are guilty, and maybe I've been guilty actually of that in the way that I framed that question around you assume is it results driven, but you've, and maybe this is part of you operating in those two spheres where you're both the manager but also in charge of the development pathway. So even within the senior game there's development that can occur, isn't there, and working with a team across a longer space. But is there quite a lot of succession planning as well? Because I imagine you've got your eye across this whole chain of a system, and just the way you do that. But how does that work? And then just if you can elaborate a bit on that, it'd be really interesting.
Yeah, it's my responsibility obviously falls around the women's national team and their performance, but also program lead for the women's side. So that is essentially like, how do we actualize the hockey playing philosophy of what we're trying to do? How do we have, I suppose, our teams and our individuals understanding our style of play and building the right technical skill set, without being too linear and prescriptive to allow us to long-term be successful. Like I'm a firm believer that successful systems and successful pathways is a result of one program with multiple offshoot teams rather than just multiple individual programs working in silos. So I think one of the most important things for us is like being very clear around how do we want to play, what type of player does that require, what type of skill set do these different positions and different kind of roles that need to be played on the pitch require. And we spend a long time kind of looking at who's next, and that's not in a negative way, but it's in a way that's positive of actually a successful senior team at the top level is a result of a pathway which provides an oversupply of athletes into that system long term. And it sounds quite negative to call it a conveyor belt, but that's in reality what we're trying to create is a conveyor belt of different athletes. So we work really, really hard to understand who's in these roles and positions now, and then contingency planning who at age under 23 might be the next people in each position, who at age under 21, under 19, and then under 17 are the people that are showing the right characteristics, because I think it's really important that if we're going to talent identify well, we understand what we're looking for and how we want to maybe push these athletes and develop certain skill sets, because when everyone looks at a player, they look through their own lens and through a different window. It's like, well, how do we, I suppose, delineate trying to just fix everything or develop everything versus develop the things that will allow that person to thrive within our current system as it stands?
So, there's a lot of things we can unpack there. Even that last point around, what's their strengths and how do you make that super strength, I suppose, is the main thing. I actually see a lot of, I mean, you said this at the very start, Chris, and I now really do believe that actually. You see, there is actually coaching's coaching everywhere. And I'm thinking within an academy system or, at youth level, that succession planning that's occurring there as well, isn't it? And a lot, you'd expect so anyway, certainly within any kind of organised structure that we're thinking, right, the 15-year-old is maybe going to the under 16s or 17s now. So are we got someone who's ready to come into there? And it probably has a little bit of an influence on selection as well, and even how you maybe scout players. Obviously, the one difference at a national level being maybe get the luxury of having more to pick. Could we come back to the point you raised just firstly around the idea of it sounds like because often a lot of environments, and I can imagine at national pathways as well, where you mentioned the contrast between having one sort of view and one system that we're trying to work through versus branching off too much and having like a lot of compartmentalization within that. So can you just expand on that? Because it's making me think about like, you have like foundation phase, intermediate phase, or is it not quite that, or is it that? What were you getting at with that point? Sounds interesting.
Yeah, we very much are like adopters of the bio-banding approach within Scottish hockey in terms of what we do, and we're very much believers in stage over age, because at the end of the day we're trying to develop long-term kind of senior international team that's highly successful. So just because somebody is their birthday is not quite on the right time and they've turned 16 and they're not quite ready for an under 18 program doesn't mean that long term they might not have the skill set and the characteristics that allow them to be really successful. I think one of the things that we've tried to do is, like, hockey is a game which is highly dynamic. There's lots of choices required to be made by an athlete, and I think we need to develop them into a way that they can do it based on a shared mental model and a kind of shared vision of how we're trying to play the game. So what we've worked quite hard on is understanding how do we chunk that philosophy down to make sure that people coming out of our emerging pathway, which is kind of essentially under 16s, what skills do they need to have, and what do they need to understand in terms of our philosophy, and actually what is the simplest way of them learning to play the way we want to play to build in the style. And then as they jump up to what we call our aspiring stage, actually what do we start to layer on based on what they've already got? So an example would be like the way that we play on the ball. There's kind of 6 principles that we might talk about that delineate how we try to play on the ball, whether that is, being our support player being outside the pass shadow of the defender. And that's a phrase that we would use quite openly, all the way down to how do we use the third player. But we wouldn't talk about all of these at every single level, because I believe if we scaffold correctly, we then build understanding. So, like, what are some of the key things that allow us in a 14, 15-year-old athlete to try and start to build the idea and the philosophy in their mind of how we play the game? Well, that might be that we want to be outside the pass shadow and we want to have our feet facing forward. That's the 2 things that we might focus on when it comes to playing on the ball. And if we can start to get those things and those become really natural, we can start to layer on how do we use the guard player, right, and someone behind the ball at the next stage, and then we can start to layer on how do we find the third player as we get on, instead of reinventing the wheel as players move through our pathway and system. Well, actually, how does the system fit the players within it to make sure that we want to take people from age 14 when they join all the way through to being a senior athlete? Now, is it realistic that we churn out tens of players every year? No, but actually, can we develop a system that does actually support the athletes in terms of them developing deep knowledge of the way that we want to play the game and how we actualize it? So we've done a lot of work in terms of doing that. And that is also linked with the fact that hockey is a game that, of course, there are positions on the pitch, but the game is so highly fluid, and the way that the ball moves and players move, players do need to be able to play across different positions. So it's very much actually what is the role that different positions on the pitch might end up having to play based on the way that the game operates. And that's a lot of work that we've done to try and clarify that.
So, it sounds, I mean, you mentioned mental models, and it sounds almost like, is language and common language, is that important to you? I'm thinking about how you're trying to scaffold this, and I wonder if sometimes we fall at the trap as coaches where maybe across a setup, like Coach A at X age group they're maybe still transmitting the same information, but just the language they're using is different from and actually I think the way that people sometimes, the way people actually, encode information into longer term memory, the words are actually quite important. We latch on to words, and words allow us to sort of, it's almost like I think the best metaphor I've been given around this is like a file in a computer, and if the folder's named one thing, it's easy to add things into that folder and need to make another folder for something else, and then crossing it. And have you seen that work out badly? Is it came from learning from mistakes, or is it just seen something that, building a momentum of that language? If I'm reading that correctly, Chris, I don't know.
Yeah, I've always been such a believer in, like, how do we build meaning attached
Mm-hmm.
to one agreed phrase. So, and I've had experiences probably through my coaching development, and I came to coaching quite young, of asking players to do something and them not understanding what it was. I'd asked a player, can you dribble the ball? When I worked at a school, and they said, oh, I don't know what that is. Watching them 10 minutes later, I said, this, like this, what you just did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, and our PE teacher calls that carrying the ball. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
wow, right, okay, so we've got ability, but we don't have an aligned approach to decide and discuss and, I suppose, provide a name to what that is. That was like a real revolutionary moment for me. A tiny moment in reality, but actually, how do we, I suppose, as coaches and people that are involved in programs and building programs, have an agreed terminology list of, well, that's what we call this?
Because
And
is
that
that
doesn't,
about efficiencies, basically, Chris? Is that efficiencies? Because even though it sounds like a small episode, it's like that incrementally builds up, isn't it? And that's potentially a lot of time wasted just in terminology if you're not getting it right. Is that?
yeah, and I suppose I am, my drive in coaching is to try and make coaching as simple as possible for the athletes that I work with. So if we've got 4 or 5 different descriptions for the same thing, and 6, 7 years down the line, you're saying to a player, you weren't outside the pass shadow, and you're having to then explain what that is. Actually, if our system is right in the heat of battle, that information can get passed across, and there can be a solution to that problem based on that feedback. And you know, efficiency, simplicity. I mean, I think that's what we're really trying to achieve in coaching. Is like, how do we get a point across in as few words as possible to an athlete under pressure? And if we can, I suppose, if the way that we coach, and we spend a whole lot more time training and coaching than we do playing, supports that, it means that, I suppose, we give ourselves a better chance of composure in the athlete when they're performing, but also ability to communicate with the athlete when they're performing and under pressure. And I see that as kind of a byproduct of getting these things right.
It makes me think about concentration, I suppose, as well. Could have been in the heat of the moments where, there's a lot of emotions and other pressures in mind. They really don't want them to have to detract attentional capacity towards stuff that just isn't as relevant. So yeah, I mean, you make such a strong point there. See what you said as well, Chris, around, embedding in the philosophy and the way of doing those things, and, incrementally, across a sort of development track of doing that. How do you, I would imagine that requires quite a bit of commitment towards an athlete. And I would wonder, how does that actually come to be in an international space where we always get, at least from the outside in, you would expect it to be highly competitive year in, year out, insofar as like no one position is safe. How do you have to commit a certain amount of time and assurance or obligation towards an athlete's development across years, even in an international space, if you actually want to see some of these longer term ideas come to fruition? Because how do you balance that? Because, at under 16s at national level, I would think, if I was playing devil's advocate, you've not got any right to necessarily say you're going to be in that international camp at under 18s. But should we? How do you set out your commitment to the players for thinking about, you want them to be in the women's senior side? How do you get that right?
That's a big question.
I know it's no easy. I know I'm not expecting a full answer either. It's just interesting to consider.
I suppose I'm really fortunate that we have like very, very able coaches across our pathway. So head coaches who manage that. I think one of the key things from my perspective is visibility. It's one. I don't believe that people should ever come into the senior environment and not, who have been through our pathway, and not already have some form of relationship with the staff that exist there. I think if that's happening, you're setting that individual up to fail, because you're restarting a relationship at the point where actually they're now under the most pressure. So I think we have to build and nurture those over time, I think, is the first thing. I think it comes down to the reality that, in our country, if we look at a youngster kind of age 15 to 17, they actually serve multiple programs. They serve often their school program, a club program, and a national program. So you have this scenario where, the player is actually serving three programs. Like, I don't think that that's the way we should view it. And one of the things that we try and talk about at the senior level and are rolling down is, well, actually, how do all of those different programs serve the player? So scenario being, we have athletes who play in their club program and also play in the international program. Well, I don't want the player to be trying to develop specific skills just for me or just for our program, and their club coach asking different things of them. Well, actually, the reality is if the player improves, they will provide for their club program better, and they'll provide for the national program better. So we have like quite a robust IDP process, which is all about actually the player driving it, and they're open, and we try and share them with clubs to say, well, this is what the player's working on, and this will make a big difference. Of course, there'll be links to elements that we need based on our system, but I think one of the biggest pieces for us is like our philosophy and our style of play, we call it the Scotland way, isn't just for our national teams. We kind of want to try and promote it to the whole domestic game in the country, and it be very much a shared, built model of actually how do we want Scottish teams to play and how do we want Scottish athletes to view the game. When it comes down to the pathway, I suppose like the biggest understanding is making people aware that where they are at on any given day is not where they could be. And we want to be trying to focus on actually where could an athlete get to. So if there is a scenario where we've got a really able kind of 15, 16-year-old, as you mentioned, well, where are they right now compared to what world class would look like in our senior level based on the type of players we want to create there? And how do we start to have those conversations which are built on, I suppose, radical candor in many ways, but at the same time, recognition of where they're at? I think one of the biggest barriers to development is a lack of kind of shared agreement within different realms of sport. And when I say realms, club, schools, international, of actually how we feed back to players. So, for example, being really complimentary of a player's ability to play, I think is really important. But if somebody in a school game where they are potentially one of the better players on the pitch plays 4 really good passes and scores 3 goals, I think what often comes about, that was an amazing performance, a brilliant performance, you were incredible. Well, actually, there were brilliant moments and incredible moments. But if we fill the individual's mind with "you're incredible, you're amazing," well, how do we make that person better? So I think like it's really important that we are complementary and supportive, but it's like how do we, I suppose, as coaches across multiple domains, get to the stage where we recognize that those are brilliant moments and incredible moments, but actually a brilliant performance is very different to delivering brilliant moments, because I think that's one of the struggles is players are used to hearing that was exceptional, that was exceptional. Then they come to the, I suppose, international domain and they're not then hearing that and they're doing the same things. Then it's not the player's fault. It's actually the system's fault in a way that we need to solve. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
No, you have, and you're giving me lots more to chat about there as well. I'm actually like, oh gosh, I'm thinking about how collaborative that needs to be, and it sounds like such a joined up approach, and I actually love that you're talking about how these various systems need to serve the player rather than the player serving these various systems, because that is the whole. And I'll be honest, I come obviously a different world in football, and like that is a real challenge trying to get that level of collaboration, because I could imagine at club level, at school levels, and things like that, they also have got their own agendas and their own things that they're aiming for, and their own standards and I think you've caught on to that as well, Chris, about what they see is good, and obviously everyone's relative, isn't it? But being able to actually join that up, that must be a real difficulty. But I could imagine when that works cohesively, like that must be so powerful. Are you getting it right in Strikers hockey, do you think, to that extent? Is it a work in progress? Is it just as a case study? It could be quite interesting to maybe for other sports, they maybe consider joining up their own thinking in that way.
I think it's a work in progress. It's probably like a utopia that we're aiming for, but there's so much work to do to bring it to life. But like, I just think of how fulfilling that system would be for our athletes if we can get it to there. Because I also think that it's really hard to be honest And like your question was around, how do we guide people and through this process? Well, actually, I think the ultimate sign of respect for somebody is being able to tell them the truth. Um, People talk a lot about, one of our values is honesty. Well, actually, the action of that is just telling the truth, and it's a case of how do you keep an athlete going along a track, but and develop them and try and add in new skills and try and help them as a human being. I mean, like, I would say so many of my conversations are, how's work? What are we doing about uni? How's that coursework going on? Like, what is life looking like? Are you getting enough time away from the sport? But
But
how do we build
what you jump,
relationships that are strong enough to say that and to say to
yeah.
somebody, you're going well, or actually you're not going so well here, and we need to make some changes.
And I think that brings us back to what you mentioned about, picking out moments and not necessarily. I think we do have that habit. I think, and you consider what you try to really like foster. You're wanting to foster a sort of growth mindset or a sort of this sort of shared ambition towards excellence. And like, I think we do have a habit of global assessments all the time as coaches. So that was a good performance. You are good at that. You are not, that moment was good. You're working hard at this element. We need to always try and push if we want athletes to push their own boundaries, we need to ensure that we're providing a macro level view of who they are that at least suggests they do need to keep pushing. I just think that is so powerful, and I think we do probably make that mistake. But then I wonder, have you always felt that way, or is this where, because you're coaching at what you would consider like that is elite level, you get to the senior management level of the women's team, but like world class and everything's relative and how we work back from that. What's your view, for example, on like, do you even use the words like elite youth then? Because I wonder like, what is elite then, in terms of like, I'm curious to know how you think about the language you use then, and if we're taking it and scaling it up a little bit to work back from that.
I mean, I'm building the plane as I fly it, to be quite honest with you. And I think we all are, because it's like the days of master plans and this is how we're going to get here and it's linear. We're working with people and the game is so dynamic and the world is so dynamic that we're always learning and we're always evolving and tweaking. Do we use the words elite, like elite youth? No, because why are we giving people a label? When we don't actually need to give people labels, and society gives people labels anyway. So we would very much look at our groups and say, like, okay, who are the ones that are really high potential? Because we have a job turning potential into reality. So we would speak about that, I suppose, like internally and within our kind of pathway staff. And also discuss, right, okay, how do we challenge the 3 or 4 who are really excelling, and how do we really push them on whilst also bringing up the ones, because it's the same in every single group, there's such a range. How do we bring up the ones at the bottom? Because the reality is your teams are only as good as all of your athletes that you select, not just your top 1, 2 or 3, and I think that's important. But
how do you manage that? If I can interject there, Kristen, sorry, how do you manage development of individuals within a team at the same time as developing the team? Because obviously it gets to you're developing teams, aren't you, to an extent, because it's competitive, it's senior level particularly, but you still also have this shared value of the individual within a team. And do they clash, or is there actually a way that there's harmony within that?
You'd probably have to ask the players how we do at it, but I think like it's natural. Like, you're going to have players who are majorly high performing in any team. They're a real strength of the team, but it's like, how do you use those players whilst also recognizing that like everybody is valuable and everybody is valued? Like, I always think whoever's on the ball is the most important player on the pitch and in our team. And actually, whoever's closest to the ball when we don't have it and is closing down is probably the most important player in our team. Again, it comes back to this idea of moments. I genuinely believe sport, hockey, it's just a game of like managing moments. And if you manage moments really well, whoever that may be, there's a really good opportunity to do things well. Like, it's different when you're in the kind of pathway teams and through our kind of performance pathway in the younger ages, because that's when you maybe do see ones who are really excelling and pushing forward. So actually it comes back again to the relationships and the fact of how do we all serve the player of saying, actually, you're going really well. We need to kind of up the ante a little bit for you. I think it's a big responsibility for staff, and we have as part of our IDP processes across the entire pathway, players will either sit at red, amber, or green in the program, which is their program management. But what we also do is we don't want selection to be a surprise. That's something which is really important to me. So we will sit in these kind of IDP blocks, which are about the kind of player developing, and be really upfront and say, okay, if we're selecting for our major tournament tomorrow, you're either very likely to get picked, possible to get picked, or not likely to get picked. And we will now, and it's kind of a bit we've just done the last year or so, is then we pick 18 players for a tournament. We'll say to somebody, right, you're possible, but if I'm being honest, you're maybe number 20. And that's always at the start of the conversation. And then that's then, I suppose, linked with the conversation here is about how we turn possible into likely, or how we turn unlikely into possible. It's always about how we can do more in support, because if you're saying to somebody, right, you're not selected, or you're unlikely to be selected, actually, I'll be the one who's the most pleased if we change that, because I think selection is the worst job a coach has to do, and will forever be the worst job a coach has to do. But I think when it comes to it, it's like, you come back to the point you made around how do you build a philosophy, how do you build a style? Well, actually, what do we do as, I suppose, coaches or leaders of that process in order to try and bring it to life? If I want people to be really creative, impactful, and playing the way we talk about playing, well, actually, the stats that I ask our analysts to take on performance need to be linked to how are people creating that impact, rather than how many errors are you making. So we will talk about impact scoring, and they're all based on impacts on the game rather than negative things. I've said to a few players recently, I couldn't tell you how many turnovers you made because I don't ask the analyst to chart it, because actually I don't really care. I'd rather we focus on making more good impacts rather than getting rid of bad impacts, because I don't think that's a way that the style we're playing kind of promotes it. So I think there's such a big onus on what we do as coaches, I suppose, across our whole system, to try and bring this stuff to life, rather than just all of it being on the player.
So let's lean into that then, because I'm really intrigued to know, like, obviously your job is the head coach, and maybe we can talk more specifically within the senior context, or the youth. You can tell me, Chris, I know a lot of times it overlaps insofar as the universal elements of this. How do you manage that? Like, how do you coordinate different coaches or support staff in a way that you think is cohesive, that's harmonious, that it offers to one of the first things that I think's came out there is sort of like role clarity to a degree, even when you're talking about performance analysts, what is their job? And I would wonder if you might even maybe bring that towards what do your assistant coaches do? How do you manage, because I suppose one of the niche elements, and you, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you go away with a national team, tournaments, they're very condensed. They're very, there is certain realities within that are quite unique. So, and I can imagine quite tumultuous and quite difficult to manage. So you probably need to have a very clear plan as a team for how you help each other, rather than just everything serving you or vice, So just if you could maybe talk to that a little bit, I'd love to get into that now.
Yeah, and I think the role changes based on who you're working with. So for me, I'm part of numerous teams. It might be a pathway coaching team, it might be our senior national team, it might be a kind of a wider context performance team, and I think all of the things you mentioned become so important. I'm a firm believer, and it's probably from lived experience of not doing it that well, that everybody is a leader in their area. I think my job is to set the vision and to be, I suppose, the gatekeeper of the vision, but it's everybody's role to bring it to life in their own departments. And it's probably a bit of learning that I've done over the last 2 or 3 years with my coach developer is, how do I bring what is a bit of a perfectionistic mindset that I have always had and I'm trying to deal with, and how do I suppose provide autonomy to others in a way that enables me to still, I suppose, have overall control, so to speak, and oversight, but that they are in charge, right, and they're leading. We work with very, very different, I suppose, different practitioners. In my team, I have a physiologist, there's a physio, you've got assistant coaches, analysts, and I think it's really key to me that when it comes to my own team, I lead on off the ball, defensive stuff. So that's where my priority lies during the game. My assistant coach, his focus is on the ball, so he has autonomy for what we're doing on the ball. Our physiologist, his job is to get the players prepared and ready, and that is throughout the year and at tournament time. So actually, when it comes to any questions on that, well, I'm going to default back to him to say, well, what do you think? And if there needs to be a decision made, I'm happy to make the decision, but I'll always say, well, what do you think? And I'm going to back it. So I think it comes down to, like, when you're playing, you want the people beside you to really back you and play for you. I believe that's exactly the same in a staff team environment. Is, well, actually, I suppose what's my role and responsibility to try and make people they own that area, and it's their area to kind of drive. And I suppose if we're looking at, like, away, the thing that always makes me the happiest is, like, we finish a game, and this is weird because it makes me happy, and you've got, like, a coach or a member of staff who's they're disappointed because it's their area and they didn't feel like we did it as well as we could have done, and they're then saying, well, that's my area to drive. And I love that. I absolutely love when people are so invested and bought in that they take real care. And that, I think, is such a sign of, like, a really strong team. So there's been a lot, I suppose, a lot of work, because I used to be terrible at this and used to want control over everything, and I probably had to teach myself to get better at saying to somebody, you're in charge, this is your area, I want you to develop it and drive it, but I want you to paint done for me first. I want you to come back and tell me what this is going to look like, so I have an understanding, not so I can say yes or no, but so firstly I can align it, so our on the ball and off the ball game is aligned, but also so that I understand it enough to just say, well, you crack on. So I definitely think it's something we're still evolving and tweaking, but it's been a big bit of work, and I think we're, like, our pathway teams are doing that too. Each coach has a responsibility. Each coach has an area to focus on, and they can focus on that in more detail, because I'm a big exponent of, we want people to think a lot about a little rather than a little about a lot, because we're going to get way more kind of detail, clarity, and simplicity out of that. So it's definitely something we're trying to push all the way down through our pathway. And I think for people, it can be quite hard to let go. But I think it's such a key skill to let go.
Yeah, but what I think's really powerful is that when you speak about let go, I think what you've showed, however, is that the autonomy that you're supporting them on is still structured, and you're still giving them boundaries that allow them to understand how to interact effectively within it in such a way that it complements and you get the synergy of their added input rather than it be going into tangents and into everyone having their own siloed sort of way of doing it. And I think that's because I think that's where people maybe get that wrong, where they feel like delegation means relinquishing all elements of your remit as the head coach, but it isn't it not? I can imagine it must be really effective, even from when you mentioned there, Chris, about, if me and you were on the sideline, and you wouldn't have me there because I wouldn't be very good at doing that, but if you and you were on the sideline, hypothetically speaking, and you told me that your job's to watch the defensive element of the game or some element of that's actually letting you as the head coach see more, isn't it, rather than you having to try and watch everything all the time, because you can't really do that. It's, you're flawed in how you're, and also we're probably flawed in bias towards what we maybe look for and what we consider. So yeah, I think I could just, is that been helpful just for the fact of just coverage? I can imagine live coaching. How do you get that right?
Hugely, because you can't watch everything, and a player will come to you and say, did you see this? And I can now say, no. But
and it
I'll
sounds
ask.
bad to the yeah, and I can imagine the players want to think that they're the center of the world. So, like, individually speaking, I could imagine as well, like, when a kid, I mean, I've experienced this myself, if a kid comes up and they say this or that, if I'm not able to give them information on that, they might feel a bit like, have that been overlooked? Whereas that coach you've got next to you is like, whoa, I've got information to give.
Yeah, and I think that's that piece around what you said around structuring it. Is, like, that was probably my fear when it first came to this idea of delegation, was, like, just fully letting go. But, again, if our philosophy is strong enough and our principles are strong enough and agreed, actually everything that these coaches do in their areas, they have autonomy, but it's within the bandwidth of these principles. And, like, I believe principles are the way to coach, because they just guide action based on what people can see in front of them. That actually, we might talk about a specific movement pattern for forwards, or a specific build-up shape and pattern for, our backline against a pressing system, but that's going to link into the principle we have of talking about finding the third player. So I think there's a really big piece that, like, we always speak about, certainly in our environment, of actually how do our staff link back to the principles as much as possible, so there's freedom within those principles, and that then makes it easier for the players, because actually fine, like this is our build-up shape, but it's to try and find the third player here. Perfect. Where we go. And I think that's one of the biggest things is if you've not done the work to define your philosophy, you've not then done the work to agree your principles, and therefore you've not done the work on the training pitch to try and build players' knowledge and understanding of those principles, then actually it is quite hard to let go. But if it's, I suppose, freedom within a bandwidth, that means that everything remains aligned.
So is there, so when you mention around, like, you should, like, I think that's what you allude to there, like, you shouldn't be seeing new approaches happening on the day of competition, but it sounds like these are things that have been trained already in practice. So if we were talking about delegation of tasks, would it serve your team well, or any team well, perhaps, if before the Saturday or the Sunday or before the competition, where I'm going to ask the assistant coach to look for this, maybe we need to also empower that coach to have time in that, with that role in a training context as well, so that they're building their understanding of it too, because I've seen it happen where it's, kind of off the cuff. And within football, this happens a lot in academies, just maybe we have a curriculum and there's things we're working on, and then on match day, before we go into the changing room, I say to our coach, you're looking at defence, and there isn't actually any reason to it other than we just need to chunk the game up, and it's just who drew that straw. I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know if that's actually, maybe we do need to see it in training a little bit more.
I think, like, again, go back to the macro level and the system level, is that you want to build players' awareness of which person looks at which thing and which voice is the consistent voice on which area. So that I look at defensive teams and off the ball all the way through the program, and my assistant will look at on the ball and develop the on the ball philosophy all the way through the program, not just on match day. So if we're training, we'll half it. I might look at counter pressing in the first half, and he might look at something in the second half, and we'll always coach against each other. That's probably the thing that we would do, because I think there's a difference between chunking things up for the sake of chunking things up and actually chunking things up for the betterment of the players. But like, clarity is really important, efficiency is really important, simplicity is really important. If we keep changing the voice on that, then actually things get muddled up, and I think we need to build familiarization to it. So we do that all the way through, and probably quite uniquely. We went to the Under-21 European Championships last year, and as part of kind of my role in the senior setup, it fell under my remit to kind of lead the Under-21s last summer. I'd seen it as a great opportunity to do something a little bit different. Instead of me leading and having another tournament as a head coach, I put myself in the assistant role at Under-21 level, and then put my assistant in the senior level as the head coach in Under-21. So we flipped roles. A team still in our pathway, and a program still in our pathway, but actually a great opportunity for him to develop as a head coach and get experience around that. We kept the same kind of focus areas, because at the end of the day, when we're at the senior level, we're trying to develop a pathway based on it. So I still focused on the defensive elements. He focused on the on-the-ball elements, but actually he fulfilled the role of the head coach and I assisted him. I actually had so much fun, right? Because it was cool to be in a very different space, and it was also nice to be in a position where I think more people should try and do this, where I knew in moments, right, head coach is going to feel a bit stressed here, or this is something that might happen here, I'm going to fix it before it happens, or I better have a conversation with this player because I reckon this is what might come next. At the end of the day, I think, like, head coach, assistant coach, they're titles. Yes, it'll come down to the point where somebody has to ultimately make a decision, and that's fine. But actually, the more that we can chunk it up and realize that actually people lead in an area, and that's way more important than somebody having overall power and autonomy. It was certainly a really cool thing to do. I think a really positive thing to do. But what I've kind of learned since we came back is it's quite an uncommon thing to do, and that not many others have done something like this.
It makes me think that, actually, because I mean, certainly as someone that's been assistant coached and then a head coach as well, I'm on sort of little space in football. But when you're assisting someone, having been in the hot seat, I suppose, if you're then leading it, you probably are aware of the things that you could be doing to make their job easier. If it's something as simple as in a developmental space, like who's had game time, who do we need to move off, that certain things, how can we get subs ready? Like, because when you're then the coach who's tasked with observing things and really paying attention to what's on the park, that sort of, you might call it administrative elements of the task, that you really want to be able to delegate that and be able to think ahead to how you might be more useful. I would imagine, but is it safer to do that? Like, I couldn't imagine, or you tell me, would there be difficulty if you were to alternate that at the senior squad? I can imagine, do you need to make sure that when you flip roles, we still ensure there's a consistency so the players aren't becoming confused? Because if it was week to week, even at under 21s, where you then become head coach, assistant coach, is that not going to create, if you're talking about you really want to, for efficiencies, players to know who to go to in these small moments, in their own breaks, intervals, whatever, how do you manage that element for the players' clarity as well?
Yeah, I don't think you'd want to chop and change it too much. It was
Yeah.
easy based on the way that we kind of were working across two programs to make it work. I think keeping as many things consistent as possible. So when it comes to a senior scenario, well, actually, when it comes to the starting team or announcing the team, well, that always comes in my bit. So like we would always cover similar things. Like a normal pre-match meeting for us would be Jimmy, my assistant, going first, and he would do his video, his plan for on the ball. I would always then jump in with my laptop and I do the plan for off the ball, for penalty corners, bit of motivation, and then starting team. And we will always do that. So when it comes to any meeting, well, he'll go first, I'll go second. So they build familiarization to on the ball is going to be first, and then off the ball is going to be second. So actually, it's interesting to think, you know, if we just said between the two of us one day, right, you're going to be the head coach and I'm going to be the assistant, would anybody notice? I don't know, because I think I would still act the same way. And I also think that he would still act the same way, because, like, again, it kind of comes down to relationships. Like, I like to get to know players and really understand them, be able to I suppose, like, see body language. I spend a lot of time when he is presenting, like, scanning the room, because I obviously know what he's saying because we've discussed it and gone through it. So I scan the room and just look for people who are not quite sure, or expressions that maybe tell me someone's nervous, not feeling as prepared, so that I've got that information for later. I actually think relinquishing some elements of responsibility allows you to really see your players a bit more and understand your players a bit more, and kind of see different things, and then we'll always kind of have discussions around actually who's the best person to speak to this player in this moment to get the best out of them on this day. Like, I think it comes down to, again, consistency. If we were chopping and changing who led on the ball and who led off the ball week to week, I think that would become quite confusing. But it doesn't mean that players won't speak to me about what they're doing on the ball, and players won't speak to him about what they're doing off the ball. I think that's also okay, but one's leading in an area and inevitably the other's assisting in an area. So we actually probably flip those roles all the time, is that he leads on the ball and I assist on the ball, and I lead off the ball and he assists off the ball.
And when, let's say, for in terms of managing sort of game day dynamics, and obviously this might be pre-game or whatever, but who does the talking then? Who would you? I mean, because sometimes again people do it where, right, head coach says a little bit here, my assistant coach says a little bit here, and again, if we're thinking about efficiencies or maybe trying to get the tension right between efficiencies but also depth and detail, like how do you manage that element? Just sometimes people think too many voices isn't great, or there are probably pros and cons to it. What's your take on that?
I think it varies based on the time. What I mean by that is hockey is a game which is played in 4 quarters. There is a 2-minute break after quarter one and after quarter three, and there is a 10-minute break at half time. There's also the ability for rolling subs. People can sub as much as they possibly want, so it's quite dynamic and people are on and off the pitch. So you've got different points at which you can intervene and assist. When it comes to pre-game, if we're scouting an opposition, like, again, we chunk it down, he will scout the opposition's pressing systems and work out how we will play against them. I will scout the opposition's play on the ball and how we will press and defend against them. And so we will always present this. So, like, when it comes to game day, he prioritizes and spends all of his time and focus in terms of, like, if there's a 30-minute pre-match meeting, he'll go for 15 minutes and I'll go for 15 minutes. Like, it really is chunked down in that way. And we would always let the person that leads in that area present the plan in that area. When it comes to, like, when we were away in Chile last week, we slightly changed it. Normally we would have both of us on the bench and somebody up high with a tactical viewpoint. We actually only travelled with two coaches, so I was on the bench and he went up high from a tactical viewpoint. So when it came towards quarter time, we would have a conversation on the radio, and I'd say, what points do you want covered? We didn't cover them. So there was just one voice in there, so it was quite easy to manage the 2 minutes, which goes pretty quickly. And in terms of making salient points rather than just making points. But then when it comes to halftime, like our process at halftime would be 10 minutes. So the players got a couple of minutes in their lines on their own, and then we'll pull everyone together. He will make points related to on the ball because that's what his eyes have been trained on for the first half, and I will make points related to off the ball, and then maybe pick up some individual conversations. So it's not like I think there's moments and times when there needs to be one voice, and we will discuss that. It might be, we might be 0-0 or 1-0 down or 1-0 up at the end of the third quarter. And actually, in my feel and gut feel says, actually, we just need one voice here because there's a really key need to have one voice. So in that moment, we'll do it. And we'll decide who that voice would be, or I would decide who that voice would be based on what we need to do. So I think one of the key things is the better you get to know people and the more you work with people and the more you're able to switch roles, the more you can work out who's the right personality for this moment. It comes back to this piece around moments again, is that I think one of the key strengths that you develop as a head coach, but you only learn it when you become a head coach and do it wrong, is that your voice does not have to be the voice all the time. It's about what is the right voice, the right message for the players at the moment based on what they need. But it comes down to trust.
On that, I'd be quite keen to see what your insights might be here, Chris, just for advice of people who work within coaching teams that, like, they aren't always going to be as functional as that. I would wonder, and I've experienced that myself, like, you're dealing with people with personalities, and when you talk about, like, who's right for the moment, isn't there also a bit of a question about who's right for the role? Because there is also, like, we can't have an assistant coach trying to be a second head coach. And I know, and I wonder if we might interweave a little bit with, I know you don't really prioritise so much titles, but there is a tension, isn't there, in terms of, I think certain hierarchies can be helpful because they do establish an element of boundary. But how and this isn't necessarily asking this out of your own experience, or certainly not for your own team, but for that coach who maybe is one of four coaches or two coaches who it's not as harmonious just yet, or perhaps maybe we're thinking about how we might pair up coaches who do work well together, because there's a lot of egotism in coaching, and a lot of time there's an inference that who talks more is who's talking best, and we need to get a lot of dynamics right there. I wonder, we're just dealing with people who are messy. So what would your advice be around that, selecting teams, pairing coaches, making that work, that trust? That's not easy.
I think the worst assistant coach that I could ever pick for myself would be myself.
Another one of you. And we all think that'd be brilliant. Just like, that's just easy. They think just like me. So it's like, there you go. And it's not.
And I also, I think, it takes time to work out, well, actually, why Jimmy is my assistant is such a good assistant for me is that we share a viewpoint of how we think the game should be played, but we deliver it in very, very different manners. It was interesting, like my son was born, so obviously I wasn't at training the day my son was born, but we had the training camp. He had said to the players, because he told me, I'm quite energetic. I am pretty loud, pretty bouncy when it comes to training, and I would drive intensity and drive quite a lot of kind of optimism throughout a session. Something I'm trying to mix up and not do quite as much to see if players can do that themselves. But one of the things he said to the girls was, I'm not Chris, I'm not going to give you this. You're going to have to drive this. And I think this is like the important thing is I'm really comfortable in my own skin. He's very comfortable in his own skin. And the rest of our staff team, I think, are very comfortable in their own skin. That you want people that are different. You want people that share your ideal, i.e., like, we like to play quite fast. We like to win the ball and counter. We want to make the game quite exciting. So to have an assistant coach who wants a possession-based model and doesn't like making errors, that wouldn't work, right? That's not positive. So I do think, like, a lot of it comes down to the personalities. Like, a lot of people talk about the views on the game. I think that's one thing, but I think the personalities have to link as well. We spend a lot of time together, so you kind of need to be around people that you get on with. So I think, like, a couple of things I would be really aware of if picking a coaching team is, firstly, how do they connect as people? And that actually, how do you get on with them as people? What are your kind of viewpoints, like, holistically on the game and how the game needs to be played, or how you want the game to be played? Do you look through a similar lens? And then I think people who are different characteristics. So, like, I'm not always the biggest fan of like insights, characteristics, and things like that about how people act, but I think they're like really key thing to think about. You want people who are different, who respond differently in different situations, because I think then that collective of different characteristics makes a massive difference to how it works. And you know, our manager is like the most ice cool person in the world. It's like she is so calm on the sidelines, and you know, things will be going majorly wrong. Somebody's got hurt. There's been a yellow card, so someone's off for 10 minutes. And I'm in my headset saying, I want this person, this person, this person on the pitch to manage these minutes, and she just makes it happen. So like
Mm-hmm.
she works really well because she just flies under the radar and is very cool, calm, and very um, system focused in those moments, whereas I would be a total disaster in those moments. So like again, it's like, how do you find the right type of person for what you want to do? I think too often people just look at the game and the sport, i.e. they've got a strength here in this part of the game, they've got a strength here, but I think we need to look a bit deeper and work out, well, what are these people's characteristics, how will you get on with them, because like trust is such a key bond. If you trust somebody, it just makes life a whole lot easier. I don't know if that's fully answered your question,
Yeah,
but
no, it is, and I suppose you've answered that at two levels as well, from the coaching team side of things, but then also kind of thinking about how you manage and work with players as well. But I'd like to zoom in on the word authenticity, because I wonder, do people maybe, and this is maybe, I think what you said there, it serves as a good lesson, I think, for coaches, either in applying for jobs or just in terms of how they act even within when they're within the job, because we have that sort of it's like a social desirability bias where we try and be what we think people want us to be. Where and I think what you probably have happens is the authentic version of yourself is going to leak through regardless. So if you put on a face of something now, it's going to come out later down the line, and that's not going to serve you well, and it's not going to serve the person you're working with well. And it kind of just shows the futility of that, because I think there's an image of a head coach that people assume we better act like in order to be seen, perhaps even in a succession. Because I'd imagine when you're a head coach, you're probably working with other who are ambitious assistant coach who often want to be the head coach, or and sometimes it's just trying to find your space, isn't it, and being world class at that. Because that was one of the things you said earlier on in the conversation about world class standards. World class standards, all these things are relative as well, and they can be within your own little sphere of influence, isn't it?
yeah, I remember somebody saying to me, 'cause I was assistant coach to the national team for a few years before I was the head coach, and somebody said, when I was given the head coach role, oh, like, do you see yourself changing? It really took me aback a little bit, because I thought, well, actually, I don't want to change,
Mm,
because I'm me. Now, there's elements of what I do that would need to change from being an assistant to being a head coach, because like the reality is, and you spoke around hierarchies earlier. Like, if we're having a conversation with a player who's not going well, I'm leading that conversation. If somebody's not getting picked, I'm leading that conversation. If there's a challenge, I'm leading that conversation. That's not something I'd ever pushed an assistant coach. That's my job. That comes with the responsibility, and I would never advocate head coaches ever passing the buck on that, because I think that's the point where you lose respect. I think there are jobs that have to be done by the person with the title,
mm,
and I think it's respectful to the players that that's done properly. When it comes to this idea of authenticity, um, I am me. I
mm,
often
mm,
I let people into my personal life. I want the players to know my kids. I want them to know about my kids. I want them to know about my wife. I want them to, you know, get a real flavor of me. And the reason for that is I want that back from them. And that's really
mm,
important to me, is like, how can we ask players to open up and to trust us and to help us, let us help guide them as human beings, and on their journey of getting better, which takes you through like joy and also despair, if we're not willing to do it ourselves. And I also think like the real you comes through, as you say, in the heat of battle and in the moment and under pressure. So why hide it? Now, I've made this mistake of, and I think every single coach will have done it. I don't think you'll find a coach on earth who could honestly say, I've not done what I thought the team wanted me to do, or what I thought somebody wanted me to do. I'm now at a stage where I'm quite comfortable that I'm going to do what I think's right, and I will also turn to the team and say, if you don't agree with this, challenge me. Um, and I think that's probably quite a healthy place to be, but I think it takes time to build that, I suppose, comfort in your own skin and of what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. I think there's a perception thing here that's really important. Is if you'd asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I would not have been able to list the things I am poor at. If you ask me now, I could be really open about the things I'm trying to get better at, and also the things I think I'm good at. And that's probably what's allowed me to be a bit more authentic. But like, I think you don't want to present a different version of yourself in a situation you've got no control of. So you just need to relinquish control straight away and don't put on a face. Of course, there are times when you have to be the head coach and put on a mask and make sure you can deal with it. But you spend too much time with people and try to build too many relationships with people, I think, to do it under a false pretense.
And is there an introspective element to that too? Because let's say, so like, because some coaches are better at like autonomy and delegation and creating vulnerability and trust than others. Like all these things are skills, so they're not necessarily just as easy as that. Like I'm just going to start trusting players and letting players feel like they can trust me because, like, I'll give an example of that, like you mentioned around open to be challenged. I've seen lots of situations where coaches would equally say they're open to being challenged. They communicate that to players challenge them. It becomes a dispute. It becomes, and that's often probably that coach not maybe pushing their own skill set too far before they're in their own developmental spectrum there. They're trying to get better at doing that, but they can't go all the way with that. And I would wonder, is it better, just curious to know your opinion, would it be better for a coach to be more closed if being more closed at the time and space where they're at, well, they're stretching themselves, well, it allows them to actually follow through on their commitment to that? Because I think the worst thing you can do and the easiest way to lose trust in players is to betray it. So, like, again, if we're talking about authenticity, if you are that coach who is a bit more distant and that's just part of your personality, I wonder, is it better to lean further into that but to mitigate it, maybe again through the synergy of other staff that you work with, than trying to be another version of yourself and create, because it's all buzzwords, isn't it? We hear that all the time. The best coaches allow for vulnerability, the best coaches allow for, we hear it, but people aren't. It's a skill, isn't it? What's your take on that? And by all means, ironically challenge me on it if you like, because I'm curious to know.
Like, it comes back to the piece around, like, don't try and be something you're not. If you're someone who's going to really struggle, like, it's hard to sit in front of a group of 18, like, for me, highly intelligent, highly successful, incredible young women, and say, because they know the answers and they know the thoughts. So if you're not sure, and actually it'd be tough, don't open up and say, I'll be challenged on this. Find somebody to work with you who would be that person for them. And then I think be okay with who you are. I think this is one of the most unique things about coaching, is like, you line up against other people and you look down the sideline. I often think, like, who are they as a person? And that you see that come through in the way their teams play. And you also look at the way that actually it's not a head coach that makes a team tick. It's an entire coaching team and program staff that makes a team tick. So, there's so many more pieces to the puzzle of, I think people just need to be happy being them. But I think one of the key things is tell people who you are. So actually, if you're somebody who is going to be quiet and a bit more actually be upfront with your team about that. By, this is my strengths, I'm going to do it. But like, this person will be this person for you. Like, we got to Chile, and one of the biggest things that we've worked hard to do since the end of 2021 is change the Scottish psyche. Like, it's probably one of my least favorite things about being Scottish is our underdog mentality. And why can't we win, right? Why can't we go out and beat these top teams as a mindset? Whereas I do think a very Scottish thing to do is say, well, they should beat us because they're a bigger nation, they've got more people. Like, it's the same across so many sports, but I want to really rubbish that title. And one of the things we'd spoken about was, like, what are we here for? Like, what are we actually here to do? Like, what is our journey and what are we trying to do? And it's amazing when you hear, like, the athletes talk about their care for it. And I said in this meeting, like, one of the things that frustrates me the most is if people disagree with, like, something I've said or a plan that I've come up with or a tactical approach, and you leave the meeting and then days down the line, weeks down the line, it's like, oh, I wasn't really sure about that. I said, like, that's probably the thing that I hate the most. Like, so I was able to be really open with them to say, so like, here, do not leave the meeting if you've got something to challenge. Let's challenge it. Let's all accept it. Actually, I'm part of the team. You're part of the team. The staff are part of the team. It's your team, but we're all part of it. So like, please challenge. But I think it's like, I'm comfortable with that now. As a younger, like, neophyte coach, I wouldn't have been comfortable with that. Not at all. I would have really struggled with it. Which is why I probably would have stuck to more of a do this, do this, do this, no questions asked
Yeah.
approach. But I wonder if that's something like that comes with experience, not with age, but with actually experience of dealing with it, to accept
Yeah.
that it's so hard. But actually, the players at the end of the day probably have quite a lot of the answers, because they certainly feel it on the pitch a lot more than I can.
There's probably, yeah, I think that what you said there. Obviously, you're someone that's learned from your successes and your mistakes, Chris. And I think even that point in the end there is probably a bit of utility to the best lesson around authenticity is to try and act like someone else and see how it runs for you, because then you'll figure out very quickly or over time this isn't actually how I do it. And I think there is an element of I think there's an element certainly in your work with younger coaches that they need to be in an environment that's going to allow them to make mistakes, and even as they build up into a level, because I think everything's relative, isn't it? Even that really experienced coach at youth level, maybe works with 15, 16-year-olds, as soon as they go up in another age group, I know there's certain things they can carry with them, but they're still, like that word, that neophyte, they become a beginner at another age group, and we need to probably give them a space to be vulnerable and to and to give them a space to figure things out the wrong way, because they didn't do that as well. And that's often, it's not hard, it's not easy to do. It's probably not as hard to do as we also say it is as well. So it just comes down to the environment helping the coach, isn't it? So
I think it's
there's a
hard
lot
to
to it.
do in your own environment. I think at times it's probably something that is quite important to us, like internally for us, is actually how do we give our emerging coach under 16 an opportunity to develop, but actually that's probably not in their environment. How do we bump them in with the seniors for a couple of days, or take them away on a trip with the seniors, or how do we have an under 21 program that has a head coach and assistant, but actually do we bring the second assistant from one of the other areas? I think it's quite hard to learn as a head coach, because you're trying to balance so much. Like, and this is the thing that I think is missing in sport, is that the job of all the staff and the coach is to look after the players, and that's basically what you're doing. But when you put yourself, like, you become good at coaching and you end up getting jobs, and then you end up in like a scenario where you're head coach of a national team, and you're no longer a coach, you're a leader, and you're thrust into this role that you've had no training for, no preparation for, and actually very little guidance for. And you're like in a scenario, for me, like, I always think I've got 34 athletes who I look out for, but 9 staff who I work with regularly. I'm there looking out for them. And I think one of the things that's missing in the coaching world is like, who's looking out for the head coach? I'm really fortunate. Like, I work with a coach developer, and actually, like, my relationship with him, it's just a sounding board that I couldn't actually deal without, because how unique is it to have somebody who's there looking at you, and looking out for you, and just watching how you're interacting and acting and presenting yourself. Is how do you get better when you've not got somebody who's helping you get better? And I think that's probably one of the things I would always advocate to any coach who's trying to improve. It's like, find someone. It doesn't have to be a mentor, it doesn't have to be a coach developer, but find someone who can help you, watch you, spend some time with you. Because, like, I after every single training camp or every single trip, like, we fire out a feedback form to our athletes, and the questions are around, like, what do you think you need to work on? How can I challenge and support you more? What could I do better for you or differently for you? Because, like, I think we should normalize feedback just being part of it. Whereas I think what becomes really commonplace is you end up in these roles and you're in charge, and it's really hard. And it's really hard, like, to get yourself in the right headspace to keep getting better, because you feel under threat and under fire all the time. So, like, actually comes back to authenticity. Like ask your players, build relationships with your players where they can give you honest feedback regularly. And so that it helps you, because it helps the team, and like positioning that, but also finding somebody who's there to help you out, because if not, you're in a scenario where you're just looking out for everybody and no one's looking out for you, and actually least of all yourself, because you're spending so much of your energy elsewhere, and then that leads to, I think, making poor decisions during gameplay, making poor decisions tactically. We were in Chile. I can't even record the number of times I said, "Oh, I really miss my kids." But I think that's okay to say to the players and actually chat with them. So yeah, I think it's just a really hard job, and we should probably all be a lot more open about how tough it is.
Oh yeah, just people are you can be both. You can have euphoria and disappointment simultaneously. You can have so many emotions, and I think that is true. We probably don't allow that vocabulary of thought to exist and their coexist together, isn't it? And that probably comes down to, like, you know, these preconceived notions of what a coach should be, how they should act, and this and that. And I quite like, actually, I think that, and just I think in the way that you justified your point around, you know, as you go up a ladder and that coaches, even a head coach, that they learn it's like a new game, isn't it? Because as much as you need to coach in order to become a head coach, being a head coach, when you say it's leadership, yes, is embedded within coaching, but when eventually you scale these things up to a point where your job is so entirely different from maybe having to account for one or two variables. You're coordinating activity among so many people. But what I actually quite like, Chris, is that you mentioned the need to get a mentor and to have someone external. For those that are listening that maybe don't feel they have access to that, or maybe they haven't explored enough routes, that there is also an in-house, use the player's voice, use them as a coaching tool for yourself, and do that as quickly as you can do, because I think that is the issue as well, isn't it? You probably, often whenever I speak to people who are head coaches, or even, and then again, relative to where they're at, and I found this even myself, even in a youth capacity, if no one's questioning you, people become stagnant because they've never been questioned, and it very quickly complacency creeps in, and you actually reduce. I think if you're not growing, you're reducing. You aren't even just staying the same, you're reducing, you know, because all of a sudden the things that kept you on your toes are no longer there, and you're not got the stimulus to do that. It's just, yeah, it's really powerful. Chris, I'm conscious, obviously, of your time as well. What we like to do at the end of some of these sort of conversations is try and give kind of some coach hats, maybe, if we will. So if I could maybe challenge you to summarise maybe some of the key messaging that we've got to here, particularly around like team dynamics and how you manage them, but also how you manage yourself as a coach. Is there maybe 2 or 3 things that you can maybe concisely say would be you would want the listener to take away and use tangibly?
I think the first one would be, when you're working with other coaches, or you have a team of people who you work with, be really clear around, when giving people tasks or giving people autonomy, getting them to paint what done would look like, so that it helps you understand, which will then help you manage and help you, I suppose, be the gatekeeper and ring fence the philosophy would be the first one. The second thing is, like, really consider, like, the impact of language and terminology across an entire system, and that if so people build meaning on one thing, and that meaning becomes deeper and deeper. And actually, that doesn't have to be a top-down approach. It could be something that the under-10s coach describes it as, that kids pick it up really well under 10. Well, that's what we're all calling it. And I think don't ever be too proud to allow that to happen in your system, because I think it's really organic for it. And the third one would probably just be, like, the importance of authenticity that we've discussed today, around, like, you don't have to change just because your role title changes. And actually, you want people to trust you and to build really deep connecting relationships with you, so that you can guide them. So I think it's really important that you give that back too, because I think that if you can do that, you're, at the end of the day, you're working with people. And I think connect with people before connecting with the sport would always be my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, no, I love that. Honestly, Chris, it's been wonderful having you on, just to be able to chat through your process and where you're at today. And also, it's amazing the great work that you're doing as well with the national team. So thank you so much. Thanks again as well for those that are listening. I hope this conversation has been nearly as helpful to you as it certainly has been to me. So yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks so much.